Welcome to Aston Business. I'm Steve Dyson, the journalist presenting this regular podcast for Aston Business School. We're now working with the Aston Centre for Growth to turn this podcast's attention towards how small businesses, known as SMEs, are coping with the economic shutdown caused by the coronavirus pandemic. This special series is called Aston Means Business, SMEs Dealing with COVID-19. We'll be talking to businesses who are taking part or who've previously taken part in Aston Centre for Growth's programmes. We'll be giving them a voice to discuss their challenges, share their experiences and explain how they're dealing with the crisis. We'll also be interviewing some of Aston Business School's top academics and other experts, getting their valuable insight, analysis and advice for SMEs. This episode will feature Sarah Beattie, the Managing Director of Fest for Children, an out-of-school club franchise. Sarah also runs several of her own nurseries. But joining me first is Cathy Daniels. Cathy is an Associate Professor here at Aston and an expert in employment law and employee relations. Hello to you, Cathy.
Hello, Steve.
Cathy, many businesses out there, especially SMEs who often don't have their own HR departments, they're facing a huge challenge about what to do with staff when they have little or no work and revenues coming in. So for SMEs out there, running everything from bars to restaurants and from children's nurseries to factories, where do they start in terms of laying off staff whilst also not losing talent for when things return to some kind of normality?
Yes, Steve, it's a very difficult situation. And I think your question there highlights what is so important for small businesses, that you don't want to lose talent because one day coronavirus will be over and we'll want to be able to move forward and go ahead and grow business again. So, before we had the government's announcement of the support that they're giving to businesses, there were some very stark choices. Quite simply, make staff redundant or lay them off if there's no work for them to do. The difficulty is that layoff isn't something that we in history have tended to think about a lot in the UK. More common in manufacturing, where businesses might have a shortfall in raw material and therefore need to lay employees off. But in most sectors, employers won't have thought of putting layoff clauses in contracts. And if there isn't a layoff clause allowing you to lay off employees without pay in the contract of employment, then if you do lay off employees, you've got to pay them. It comes back to the implied duties in the contract of employment, a duty to provide work and a duty to provide wages. So the stark choice for businesses, for most businesses, was make staff redundant and therefore lose this talent that you've just referred to in your question, or lay them off and keep paying them to do nothing. And of course, if businesses have no money coming in, they can't do that.
Yes, it was quite stark for businesses at the beginning, wasn't it, Cathy? But what's in place now with the government's announcement of various job retention schemes and some phrases which are perhaps being heard of for the first time by many of us, things like furloughing?
Yes, we now have the job retention scheme, and I'll explain it now, but I just need to say that the details about the job retention scheme have been coming out bit by bit, and so I'm telling you what we know at the moment. So the first thing to note is it's a scheme that applies back to the 1st of March 2020, and it's a temporary scheme specifically to support businesses who are adversely affected due to coronavirus. And it's open to all employers who have a PAYE scheme as of the 28th of February 2020. And it does cover charities, small businesses, large businesses. It's not really expected to cover the public sector, partly because a lot of the public sector is still operating because it offers essential services, and also because there is funding within the public sector for wages on the whole. So it's primarily going to be for the private and the not-for-profit sector.
Mm-hmm.
What it basically does is it allows the employer to say to an employee, I want you to move to being a furloughed worker. And as you rightly say, furloughed is a new term that we've not had before. Now, the scheme is subject to normal employment law provisions, and if you change the status of an individual, you're varying their contract of employment. So the starting point is that you've got to talk to employees and get their agreement to them becoming a furloughed worker. Now, that might all sound a bit tricky. What if employees don't agree? But let's come back to where we started. The stark reality is that the alternative is probably redundancy. Most employees are going to agree to become furloughed workers. But it can't be absolutely everybody. There are some people who can't be furloughed. So, for example, if somebody was not on the payroll on the 28th of February 2020, so they're a new hire, they cannot be furloughed. So this only applies to people on the payroll as of 28th of February 2020. If somebody is on sick leave or self-isolating, then they can't be furloughed at the same time. When they're well enough to come back to work, and therefore they're no longer on sick leave, self-isolating, they can be furloughed at that point. But if you remember, the government has written to 1.5 million people who have underlying health conditions, asking them to stay at home for 12 weeks. They can be furloughed.
Okay.
Also, if you've got somebody who was made redundant before this scheme was announced, they can be rehired if they were made redundant after the 28th of February and then furloughed immediately. So that is possible.
So in terms of these different scenarios, it's obvious that companies are going to have to look carefully at where they are and where each employee is. And there's one or two examples which I've come across talking to businesses myself. I mean, I went down to have my car MOT'd last week, Kathy, and the chap there who runs the business didn't particularly know what was going on, and I was advising him to talk to his accountant. But one of the things that he said was, well, my staff are okay for a week because I've agreed they can all take a week's holiday and I'll pay them in full. And whilst I took my hat off to him for his gesture there, I did say, well, maybe talk to your accountant. You might not have to do it in that way. You might be able to do it in a different way. Am I right to give him that warning?
Yes. If I could just pick up on the point about annual leave and then fully answer your question, you can say to employees, I want you to take some leave. What you have to give them is, the notice you give them is twice the length of leave. So if you said to employees, I want you to take a week's leave, you'd have to give them 2 weeks notice that they got to do that. But yes, what your garage owner was doing was in effect very generous because it was paying a week's salary for those workers. If they furlough the employees, then the employees get at least 80% of their salary. So the way it works is that the employee is furloughed. There will be a portal by which the employer will inform the HMRC which workers are furloughed and their wages. And then the HMRC will basically reimburse the employer in form of a grant, which is 80% of the individual's salary. Then the employer can top that up if they want to, but they don't have to. But this 80% is capped. So it's capped at £2,500 per month.
I understand, Kathy. Now, Kathy, thanks very much for that insight so far. I think it might be useful for us to talk to a business to find out how they're coping and to come back to the employment issues afterwards to see what you think about what they're doing. So if you can stay with us, I'd be really interested in your views on how my next interviewee is coping with COVID-19. Is that okay with you, Kathy?
Yes, of course.
Joining me online now is Sarah Beattie. She's the Managing Director of Fest for Children. Hello to you, Sarah.
Hi there, Steve.
Sarah, tell us a bit more about FunFest, where you're based and what you do exactly.
Yes, absolutely. So FunFest predominantly runs children's holiday clubs. The head office is based in Solihull, but we run holiday clubs for children from as far down as Orpington in Kent and as far north as Chorley. We've got 23 franchise clubs across the country. And earlier this year, we started FunFest day nursery franchises. So we're hoping to get our first day nurseries off the ground later in 2020. Although obviously with the current situation, our business is very much interrupted at the moment.
I'm sure it is. And just to get a more detailed feel for your business, can you just tell me about the business structure? How many people you employ directly? How many are employed on the franchise as far as you know? What kind of structure is there?
Yeah, sure. So FunFest for Children has 5 directors. I'm the managing director and I have 4 colleagues working with me. We also have 3 PAYE employed people within the head office. The franchisees are actually all self-employed. They run their own limited companies, and the people that work for them are seasonal workers on sort of 0-hour temporary contracts that just work during the holidays.
Okay, and just to include everything that you do, I understand that you also run your own nurseries. Is that right?
Yeah, so I also run a separate limited company, which is a day nursery based in Solihull, which is where I've grown the expertise to then be able to go on and launch FunFest day nurseries. So I have 2 separate limited companies, both of which obviously have been massively affected by the current situation.
Of course they have. And just to get a picture of that, your own day nursery, the separate business, how many staff do you employ there?
So I've got 26 staff in that business. And yeah, that business has been trading for 14 years. So we're very well established. We're quite a large day nursery, and we're in the middle of a large expansion plan as well across to new premises. So lots going on in that business. And as I said, everything is very much on hold. The nursery actually had to close its doors, sadly, on Tuesday because of COVID-19.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the shutdown's affecting everyone. And just with that in mind, now we've got a picture of your different businesses there, Sarah. How is COVID-19, the pandemic, affecting your operations and your franchisees, both your company, your nursery, and your franchisee company? And I realise it's shut down, but how's it affecting them in terms of the staff and cash flows and all those things?
Well, it's catastrophic. It's absolutely unprecedented, isn't it, for everybody? And, at least everybody is healthy and well at the moment, which is obviously the priority. In a business sense, the day nursery business, we had tried very hard to keep open for key worker children and for critical workers. But on a practical level, with the lockdown, most parents have done everything possible to keep their children away, keep them home, keep them safe. So we actually came down to only having 3 or 4 children needing to use the services, hence closing the business on Tuesday. So I have just this morning furloughed all my workers in the day nursery business. We've also cut the cash flow back to an absolute minimum, all our outgoings back to an absolute minimum. We've just had to get very lean very quickly, had to work out different scenarios because, of course, none of us know how long this situation is going to last. So whilst we can prepare a sort of 3-month cash flow, we also need to be looking at a 6-month cash flow in case the situation doesn't get under control and we're able to resume business quite quickly. So, yes, it's fairly devastating. Luckily, with that business, we have been in a position where we have got cash reserves. And I have to say, the government support that's been put in place is a fantastic backup and a support blanket for us. So we will be applying for the business interruption loan scheme. And also the bank have been incredible in being very proactive in their support of the business and offering overdraft facilities, etc., if they're needed. In terms of the franchising business, From a franchisor level, again, we have been very devastated. We can't operate at all. We have no income coming in at all at the moment. We clearly won't be able to generate any income over the Easter trading period, which is normally very busy for us, and very unlikely to be able to trade in May. We are hoping to be back in business for the summer. If we're not able to operate over the summer, then really, we will have to write off 2020 entirely. But again, the government support is incredibly helpful for that business. We have applied for the business interruption loan scheme. We've had a look at our cash flow and we've worked out what finances we will need for the next 6 months. And our bank, which is HSBC, have been very, very proactive with their communication, and they seem to have adapted their systems and got their portal open for loan applications very, very quickly. So I think the main thing is we have a plan. We furloughed our workers, and furloughed was a name that I had never even heard of before this time last week, Steve. So we've had to get up to speed with things very quickly. As most small businesses have. Most of us don't have HR departments to rely on.
Of course not. And it sounds, if you don't mind me saying, Sarah, like you've got a very calm and reasoned business approach to it. And there's an enormous amount of different things coming out from the government in terms of rates and VAT and staff and insurance and loans and grants. And yet somehow you seem to have got your head around it.
Well, I think, getting knowledgeable quickly is the key, isn't it? It's, you have to find out your position and where you stand and what you're eligible for very quickly. The Aston cohort has been incredible. I'm part of the Aston Growth Programme, and we have a WhatsApp group which has been incredibly active. It covers a very wide range of small businesses, some of which are accountancy businesses, and they've been incredibly helpful in sharing the information that's out there. And there does seem to be a lot of support and a lot of availability for finance. So I think it's been about getting up to speed very quickly, understanding our position. Luckily, we have just done a very, very useful cash flow workshop at the Aston programme. So most of us kind of had our cash flows worked out, and therefore it's quick and easy to be able to adapt those. Look at what we can scale back, look at what we can cancel, and work out our position. The most important thing in any business is the ability to be resilient, and we're certainly being tested on that at the moment.
No, I'm sure you are. And I wanted to ask about something you've mentioned a few times in terms of staff and the fact that you've had to furlough them. How's that gone in terms of communicating that with the staff in the way that they've received it?
I've had very open and honest conversations with my staff about furloughing and what it means. For me, it does not mean that I am making my staff redundant. I very much hope to be back in business and to be open and ready for business again on a scaled up version of that business as soon as I possibly can. So for me, it's about being able to access the grant schemes to help us. And furloughing my workers means that I can access the 80% grant scheme that the government have offered. So
at least your workers, once that kicks in, will be getting 4/5 of their salary in the meantime. Yes,
and I'm going to use the business reserves to pay my workers 100% of their salaries, at least for the first 2 months. I have worked out that I can do that. They are incredibly important. I don't have a business without those people. So that's my priority and has been my priority since all of these announcements about lockdown.
I understand. And from what you've said, it sounds like you're quite pleased with the government's response. You've also mentioned your bank's response and how active they've been. And that's great. I want to ask you perhaps a more difficult question, maybe one you want to think about, but what else is needed? Lots of stuff has come out. Banks being good, government's offering this, that and the other, smashing. But what else do you need at the moment?
Well, we still need a lot, and we still need a lot of support. I think it's been incredibly stressful over the last week or so because it's changing every day. The situation's constantly changing, and the devil is in the details. So the high-level announcements made by the government have been reassuring and supportive. But then when you drill down to try and find out the detail, a lot of that quite clearly hasn't been written yet and hasn't been decided yet. And that's completely understandable. Everybody's trying to play catch up with this situation. So we do need some clarity. We do need to be able to access the support. And this week that has started to become a little bit more transparent about how we access funding and apply for things. I would say the most frustrating for me at the moment is getting transparency from insurance companies. It's been very frustrating hearing that I have a high level of insurance cover for loss of business. However, that does not include COVID-19, which is incredibly frustrating because obviously COVID-19 wasn't even heard of when we took our insurance policies out. So that sort of thing needs clarifying.
Sarah, one last thing I want to ask you to leave you with, really. You've got your head around this. You're working closely with your accountant, I would imagine, certainly with the banks and with your advisors on how to cope. But just in short, if you've got some top tips for other businesses listening, what would you advise them to do as those first steps if they're currently freaking out about cash flows and employees and what they're going to do? How would you give them some tips to calm things down?
I've launched a Survive and Thrive plan for my franchisees. So phase 1 is Survive, and then phase 2 is Thrive. So it's very much trying to give some optimism that this is a temporary situation. In the Survive stage, it's so important to just find out what you are eligible for in terms of support, scale back all your non-essential expenditure to get as lean as you possibly can, to make a plan, to get a really, really clear cash flow, and to speak to your bank. Speak to your bank and try and get that support in place because it just then takes the pressure off. Lots of businesses in the cohort that I work with have been able to be really adaptable, take their businesses online and find other ways of still selling their products and services. So again, that might be a viable option for many businesses out there. And, I do believe that we will all, come back from this and have some time to actually sit and reflect and think about how we want to take our businesses forward.
Sarah, thanks so much for taking the time to explain how you're coping. And I think a lot of people will find a lot of benefit from listening to this. So, I really do appreciate that. And best wishes to you and your staff.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
That was Sarah Beattie, Managing Director of Fun Fest for Children. Hopefully Cathy Daniel, an Associate Professor here at Aston and an expert in employment law and employee relations, is still with us. Hello to you, Cathy.
Hello.
Cathy, what did you think about the way Sarah's approaching the current crisis?
I think she's doing exactly the right things. And I think what she's doing is demonstrating too, as what we said at the start, this choice that we would have had without the job retention scheme. And she's explained very well how she's having to balance the needs of the business and the needs of the employee and trying to think of both. And I think her interview just show that difficulty that so many small businesses are facing.
And I know that it's early days and that she did say that it might only be for the first couple of months, but she also said that she was intending to use the company reserves to top up her staff's salary to 100% for at least 2 months, which sounded pretty decent of her and must mean quite a lot to the employees in terms of morale.
Yes, indeed. As I said earlier, there is no requirement on the employer to do that, so she is being generous. But also it comes back to the fact that we do want to keep good employees and we want to keep them motivated.
Absolutely. So I've got a couple more questions for you, Cathy, before we end this podcast. And the first one is, I know that the government has offered many different things, and also that things are fast changing. So extra advice is coming out almost on a daily basis. But if you could summarise one thing for me, what else is needed from the government?
I think one of the difficulties with the job retention scheme that I think a number of businesses are facing is that employees cannot work at all for the employer while they are furloughed. And they have to be furloughed for at least 3 weeks. So what you can't do is furlough employees for a week and then you get some work for them to do and take them back for a week and then furlough them for another week, etc. That is not allowed under the scheme. And I think as things maybe start to ease a little bit, that is an area that might become quite difficult, because it's quite possible that businesses aren't sort of going to go from nothing that they're facing at the moment to lots of work for everybody to do just like that. It's likely that things are going to build back up again gradually. And I think that's going to be an area that probably proves a little bit difficult and might need a little bit more thought.
A bit of flexibility, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And finally, Kathy, for small business owners who are listening today, they're seeking advice and trying to deal with this crisis. For a lot of them, it's the first time they've ever faced anything like this. They're sometimes very small businesses. They sometimes don't have HR departments. They might have a distant relationship until now with their accountants. So we're dealing with a range of different experiences and skill levels. In a summary, what are your top tips for them to start to think about this situation in terms of employment?
One of my top tips is to be very careful about understanding the detail of the job retention scheme. Over the last few days, before we've got more detail from the government, and there are still questions that aren't answered, but I have read so many things on the internet with people guessing what the scheme is going to be. So do be careful that you don't take advice from somebody that is giving it their best guess. What is important is to go to the gov.uk website and see what the government is actually saying, because there has been a huge amount of speculation. So that's my top tip number one. And my other top tip is to keep communicating with employees, because it's a very worrying time, of course, for employees, a very worrying time for business owners. But employees do understand the difficulties that the businesses are facing, and most of them want to work with the employer to help the business as well as help themselves. So I think keeping those communication lines open, particularly if employees are furloughed and therefore not at the workplace, is really important.
No, some great tips there. And Kathy, thanks very much for joining us. And I do wish yourself and your own family the very best during this period as well.
Thank you.
Kathy Daniels and Sarah Beattie, thank you both for joining us today. I know that many owners and staff of SMEs listening would have found your experiences and expertise very useful. That wraps up this latest podcast in our special series. We'll be back in the next few days with more case studies of how businesses are coping and more crucial analysis and advice from academics and experts here at Aston. Aston means business. SMEs dealing with COVID-19. Thanks for listening.